Imagine you're a tree, you're just standing there, doing tree things, pulling carbon dioxide out of the air, deeply anchoring your roots into the dark soil, growing your rings millimeter by millimeter. You are entirely stationary. You have no nervous system. You have no brain. You have no eyes to see the sunset, no ears to hear the wind howling through your leaves, and absolutely no concept of an impending deadline or a mortgage payment. There's just you, the soil, and the slow, silent chemical engine of photosynthesis chugging along under the morning sun. And then, out of absolutely nowhere, a massive, noisy, bipedal creature with a chainsaw approaches your trunk, cuts a massive wedge into your flesh, and leaves you to collapse into the forest floor. What happens to the forest when you die? Does the landscape notice your absence? Do the surrounding trees feel something? Do they send out a silent chemical distress signal? Or is it just nothing? Just silent, unfeeling biology doing its thing in the void of an indifferent wilderness? That question, whether plants actually communicate, remember, and look out for one another in a way that resembles a conscious community, sounds like a simple, tree-hugging myth. It sounds like something someone tells you at an organic juice bar at 2 a.m. to get you to feel bad about eating a salad. But the actual science behind it is one of the most deeply unsettling, beautiful, and mind-bending rabbit holes you can possibly fall into. And by the end of this video, I promise you will never look at a forest, a lawn, or even a single houseplant the same way again. Let's go. Part 1. The biological machine, myth. First, let's establish something incredibly important. Plants are not stupid. I know that sounds entirely ridiculous because they don't move, they don't have faces, and they don't exactly pass the SATs. But for a really long time, centuries actually, the dominant scientific view was essentially that plants are passive biological vending machines. They take in water, they take in sunlight, they spit out oxygen, and they grow toward the light because of basic mechanical reflexes. They react to stimuli, but they don't process context. They don't understand things. They just react. This mechanical worldview was so widespread that botany for generations was basically treated like the study of slow motion rocks. If a plant bent toward a window, it wasn't because it wanted the light. It was because the cells on the shaded side elongated due to a hormone called auxin. Keep it simple. Keep it entirely mechanical. And look, the rigid scientific principle absolutely has its place. Science should be fundamentally cautious. We shouldn't project human emotions, human intentions, or Disney-style consciousness onto everything that happens to have green leaves. But here's the problem. We overcorrected massively. For decades, the mere idea of plants having a rich, interconnected social life, processing complex ecological data, reading local environmental threats, and altering their behavior based on past experiences was completely dismissed. It was seen as unscientific, hopelessly naive, and almost embarrassing to bring up in serious academic circles. If you talked about plants talking to each other, you were viewed as a mystic, not a scientist. And then the research started rolling in, and it turns out plants are doing a lot more than we ever thought, like a lot more, in ways that should fundamentally change how we relate to the living world around us. Part 2. The Internet of the Forest. Let's start with one of the most well-documented cases in the entire field of modern ecology, the phenomenon popularly known as the Wood Wide Web. If you walk into a forest, you look at the trees and you see individual entities. You see an oak, a birch, a pine, all standing separately, competing fiercely for resources like sunlight and water. It looks like a classic Darwinian free-for-all, every tree for itself. But beneath your boots, hidden under a few inches of decaying leaves and soil, there is a massive, incredibly dense network of fungal threads called mycelium. These threads are unimaginably tiny, but they are everywhere. A single teaspoon of healthy forest soil can contain miles of these microscopic fungal filaments. For a long time, scientists knew these fungi associated with tree roots. They called them mycorrhizae. The textbook explanation was simple. It's a basic transactional trade. The fungus absorbs water and minerals from the deep soil and gives them to the tree roots. In exchange, the tree gives the fungus carbon and sugars it made via photosynthesis. A nice, neat mechanical trade. Everyone goes home happy. But in the late 1990s, a researcher named Dr. Suzanne Simard at the University of British Columbia decided to test if that was the whole story. She injected radioactive carbon isotopes into individual trees in a forest to trace where the energy actually went. What she discovered shattered the mechanical paradigm forever. The carbon didn't just stay inside the tree that produced it, and it didn't just go to the fungus. The fungus was acting as an active underground rooting system, a biological internet. The carbon was moving through the fungal network from one tree directly into the root systems of entirely different trees. Let that sink in for a second. An old, massive Douglas fir tree that was bathed in sunlight was actively shipping its excess sugars through the underground network to a tiny, struggling cedar seedling, growing in the deep, dark shade of the understory, keeping it alive. This wasn't a ruthless, individual competition. This was a highly managed, cooperative public utility system. When a tree is dying, it doesn't just let its resources rot. It runs a rapid, systemic data dump, pumping its remaining sugars, nitrogen, and phosphorus back down into the fungal network to distribute to its neighbors. The forest isn't just a collection of trees, it's a singular, deeply integrated superorganism. Part 3. Airborne Warning Networks. But the underground internet is only half the story. Plants don't just talk through the soil, they blast warnings through the open air. Imagine you're an acacia tree in the African savannah. Life is good, the sun is hot, and you're minding your own business. Suddenly, a giraffe walks up and starts ripping off your leaves with its long, sandpaper tongue. You can't run away. You don't have teeth. You don't have claws. What do? Within minutes of a giraffe taking its first bite, the acacia tree begins pumping massive amounts of a chemical compound called tannin into its remaining leaves. Tannins are bitter, astringent, and in high enough quantities, they are highly toxic to a giraffe's digestive system. The leaves instantly transform from a delicious snack into unpalatable, stomach-churning leather. The giraffe gets frustrated and stops eating. But here is where it gets genuinely insane. The attacked acacia tree doesn't just protect itself. As its leaves are crushed, it releases an airborne gas called ethylene. This gas wafts on the breeze downwind. When the neighboring acacia trees that haven't been touched by a single giraffe, detect the ethylene gas floating through the air, their internal systems instantly go into high alert. They don't wait to be bitten. They immediately start pumping tannins into their own leaves ahead of time. They pre-arm themselves against an enemy they can't even see yet. The giraffe, it turns out, actually knows this. Giraffes have evolved to specifically walk upwind when they are foraging. Precisely so they can eat from acacia trees before the airborne chemical alarm system can warn the next trees down the line. Think about that for a second. An entire evolutionary chess match is being played out across the savannah using invisible clouds of gas and preemptive chemical warfare, all between an animal and a group of organisms we traditionally classify as completely passive. This isn't a fringe anomaly unique to Africa. If you've ever walked outside, right after someone mows their lawn, you know that incredibly distinct fresh-cut grass smell. We tend to associate that aroma with summer, relaxation, and weekend chores. But from a biological perspective, that smell is actually an industrial-scale distress siren. When grass blades are torn apart, they release volatile organic compounds called green leaf volatiles, GLVs. To other plants, those compounds are an unambiguous warning signal. The predator is here. Prepare for damage. Even more terrifyingly, some plants use these airborne signals to summon targeted military reinforcements. When certain species of lima bean plants are attacked by spider mites, they don't just warn neighboring bean plants. They emit a hyper-specific cocktail of chemical aromas that attract predatory mites, monsters that specifically hunt and eat the spider mites attacking the plant. The plant literally calls in an airstrike from an entirely different species to wipe out its attackers. Part 4. Anchoring the skeptic. Let's pause here and address the absolute skeptic in the room, because it's a completely fair argument and it deserves serious scientific respect. Maybe the plant isn't warning its neighbors at all. Maybe the release of these gases is just a basic accidental byproduct of physical tissue damage, like blood spilling from a wound. If a neighboring plant happens to detect that gas and triggers its own defenses, that's just a passive, lucky evolutionary accident. The neighboring plant is just eavesdropping. There is no intentional communication, no community, and absolutely no shared awareness. It's just mechanical chemistry operating under the cold rules of natural selection. That is a highly legitimate scientific concern. It applies to a lot of basic plant reactions, certainly. But here's where the data gets incredibly complicated, highly nuanced, and intensely fascinating. Researchers studying plant behavior have identified that plants can actually distinguish between family members and total strangers. They possess a capacity known as kin recognition. In a series of groundbreaking experiments, scientists grew sea rocket plants, a species of beach-dwelling flower, in pots together. When plants were potted with complete strangers of the same species, they aggressively accelerated their underground root growth, desperately competing to suck up all the nutrients and water before the stranger could get them. They acted like textbook, cutthroat competitors. But when plants were potted with their own biological siblings, seeds harvested from the very same parent plant, something beautiful happened. They actively restricted their root growth. They shared the soil space equitably, making room for their family members to get enough nutrients to survive. A plant operating completely without a brain or eyes is somehow capable of analyzing the biochemical signatures of the root exudates in the dirt, recognizing its own flesh and blood, and modifying its survival strategy from aggressive hostility to cooperative restraint. That is not a blind, accidental reflex. That is a highly calibrated, context-dependent social choice. Part 5. The Mid-Script Chalk. Now, let's talk about something that rarely, if ever, comes up in this conversation, and it's wildly counterintuitive from a modern perspective: plant memory. How can something remember an event if it doesn't have a single neuron, let alone a cerebral cortex? It sounds like an absolute neurological impossibility. Enter the Mimosa pudica, commonly known as the sensitive plant. If you touch the leaves of a mimosa plant, they instantly snap shut and droop down. It's a rapid defense mechanism designed to scare away insects and herbivorous animals. But closing those leaves requires a massive expenditure of water pressure and metabolic energy. It's an expensive reflex to trigger. An evolutionary biologist named Dr. Monica Gagliano designed an experiment to see if these plants could learn. She built a specialized dropping device that would safely plunge potted mimosa plants down a short distance into a soft cushion. It was an unexpected drop that terrified the plants, causing their leaves to instantly slam shut. She repeated the drop every few seconds. After a few drops, the plants realized something fascinating. They were falling, but they weren't being eaten, damaged, or hurt. By the 8th consecutive drop, the plants completely stopped closing their leaves. They stayed wide open. They had analyzed the stimulus, realized it was an empty threat, and altered their behavior to save energy. The cynic would say, well, the plants were just tired. Their muscles were exhausted from snapping shut. To prove that wrong, Dr. Gagliano took those same drop plants and immediately shook them from side to side manually. The plants instantly slammed their leaves shut. They weren't exhausted at all. They knew exactly what a sideways shake meant, and they knew exactly what a vertical drop meant. They had memorized the difference. But here is the absolute kicker. Gagliano tested those same plants again weeks later. For 28 days, the plants were left entirely alone in a peaceful greenhouse. When she placed them back into the dropping apparatus and plummeted them down without warning, the plants didn't close their leaves. They remembered. They retained the specific memory of that benign drop for an entire month. To put that into perspective, a brainless, root-bound plant has a retention span for non-threatening mechanical stimuli that outperforms several species of insects and small animals. The memory isn't stored in electrical synapses. It is hard-coded into the plant's epigenetic architecture, chemical switches that flip on and off inside the DNA itself in response to the environment. The plant's entire physical body operates as a decentralized living brain. Part 6. Elevating the stakes. Let's zoom all the way out now and ask the deep evolutionary question, because it's the one that really ties this entire planetary puzzle together. Why would the universe design a world where intelligence, communication, and memory are distributed across organisms that can't run, scream, or build cities? Evolutionarily, it feels almost paradoxical. For the vast majority of our civilized history, humans have operated under a rigid, vertical hierarchy of life. Humans are at the absolute top. Animals are somewhere in the middle because they can move and feel pain, and plants are firmly at the bottom, relegated to the status of background scenery, structural lumber, or caloric fuel. We view them as resources to be extracted, managed, and consumed. But where does this profound arrogance leave us? It leaves us profoundly isolated. It cuts us off from a massive, ancient cognitive architecture that has been quietly managing the biosphere of this planet for hundreds of millions of years before the first hominid ever stood up on two legs. Plants make up over 80% of all biomass on Earth. Humans and all other animals combined account for a pathetic fraction of a percent. We are a tiny, loud, temporary biological anomaly riding on the back of a green planet. And the machinery that keeps this entire planet habitable, the systems that regulate the temperature, create the soil, maintain the atmospheric balance, and filter the water, is completely run by the cooperative labor of the plant and fungal kingdoms. They built the world we live in, and they run it like a highly sophisticated, multi-million-year-old public utility company that never sends a bill. When you stand in an old-growth forest, you aren't standing among a bunch of individual timber assets. You are standing inside an ancient, highly conscious, deeply integrated library of lived experience. The old mother trees at the center of the network use their massive root systems to stabilize the entire microclimate of the valley. They keep track of past droughts, memorizing the chemical signatures of historic fires, and they use that data to condition the next generation of seedlings, passing down survival blueprints through the fungal wires. Part 7. The Cognitive Chasm. Here's where we arrive at the deeply uncomfortable, highly existential part of the story. The transition from viewing nature as a living, interconnected community to treating it as a casual, extractive mass consumer market has been a total historical disaster for human psychology. When European settlers arrived in the pristine forests of North America, they saw an endless mechanical supply of timber. They clear-cut millions of acres, separating the massive mother trees from the soil, completely severing the underground fungal connections that had taken thousands of years to mature. They assumed that if you leave a few young trees standing, or if you replant a monoculture grid of industrial pine saplings, the forest will simply regrow like a factory line. But industrial timber plantations are completely silent. They are sick. Without the ancient, diverse underground network of mycelium to root nutrients, without the historical memory of the mother trees to guide their chemical defenses, these artificial forests are highly vulnerable to diseases, catastrophic insect infestations, and devastating wildfires. They are the ecological equivalent of an orphanage filled with traumatized children who have completely lost their language, their culture, and their history. A modern corporate logging executive and an indigenous forest steward both look at the exact same tree. They have almost nothing else in common. The gap between an ancient ecosystem managed through cooperative chemical balance and a modern industrial monoculture, engineered to maximize short-term financial extraction, is one of the single largest moral and psychological chasms in human history. Both involve plants. Almost nothing else is the same. So when did plants develop this intelligence? The honest answer is we don't know exactly, and we probably never will. The physical fossil record shows fungal-plant partnerships dating back at least 450 million years, right to the very moment plants first crawled out of the ancient oceans and colonized the barren, rocky land. The behavioral drive that underlies this cooperation, the desire to share resources, to communicate threats, to memorize trauma, and to look out for the survival of the collective community is almost certainly as old as life itself. It may be the fundamental cognitive leap that allowed complex ecosystems to emerge in the first place. The ability to connect cause and effect, to look at a chemical signal and think, last time that molecule arrived, a predator was coming. Let me change my leaf chemistry. That isn't just a blind mechanical reflex. That is a highly functional form of intelligence. Part 8. The Unbroken Thread. What we do know with absolute certainty is this. The behavior is extraordinarily old. It predates our species. It predates agriculture. It predates the concept of a brain, a spine, or a bone. It predates every empire, every war, and every textbook you've ever opened in school. By the time the very first human ancestor looked out across the primeval landscape, the forest was already talking. The underground networks were already routing resources. The acacias were already throwing chemical warnings into the wind, and the mosses were already recording the memory of the seasons in their physical structures. The specific species have changed, the continents have drifted, and the climate has shifted, but the behavior, the deep, quiet, cooperative intelligence of the plant kingdom was already ancient by the time anyone thought to write it down. There is something deeply poetic about that. For all the things that separate modern humans from the wild natural world around us, our smartphones, our concrete skyscrapers, our global flight paths, and the truly baffling amount of digital content we consume every single day, there are these thin, unbroken threads of biological continuity that run straight through hundreds of millions of years of earthly experience. Sunlight, soil, breath. The very first land plants sat under the same sun and breathed the same raw atmospheric elements that feed the grass growing outside your window right now. And they figured out how to do something miraculous with it. They figured out how to build a community. They learned how to look out for one another. They learned how to remember. And then they passed those choices down through millions of generations of evolutionary knowledge that never got stored in a digital cloud, but got lived out in the dirt. That's how the vast majority of life on this planet has always worked. Not through isolation, not through ruthless hyper-individualism, but through lived, collective experience woven into the very fabric of the landscape. Either way, the next time you step outside, trim a branch, walk through a park, or catch that sharp, fragrant whiff of fresh-cut grass on a warm summer evening, you aren't just participating in a casual modern moment. You are stepping directly into an ancient, sophisticated planetary conversation that has been running smoothly without us for 500 million years. You're doing what living things on this earth have always done.